All right, this is the Murray Amateur Radio Club. Welcome, everybody. We're going to be talking today about, let me see if I can get this to go away so that I'm not displaying the same thing twice for everybody here. We're going to be talking about time. It's if you guys remember the old LDS TV commercials that where the family would be doing something and then they would come back with, "It's about time." And that's where I got the top of the subject or the title of this presentation from. So the presentation is about time, and we're going to be talking about time.
The title of a very funny 1970-ish TV show about astronauts who accidentally went back in time and lived among cavemen.
Ah, I did not know about that. All right. So let's see. What is time? So time is a system of measurement for the duration of events. Okay. That is the technical definition of time. We use time to regulate our activities during the day, and it was originally based on purely natural events like sunrise, noon, and sunset. Over time, it became important to be able to refer to specific times of the day. For example, if you wanted somebody to meet you for lunch, they needed to know when, not just where to meet you, but when to meet you. And if you wanted them to meet you at noon, you would say, let's meet at noon for lunch at such and such a place, right? Other times of day became more important as well, because the only three times you could refer to with sunrise, noon, and sunset were sunrise, noon, and sunset. And that doesn't help you if you're planning an event for sometime after sunset or before sunrise or in the middle of the day somewhere other than at noon, right? So the day was divided into 24 equal periods. Now, originally it was divided into 12 daytime hours and then 12 nighttime hours. And that necessitated that the hours were not the same length, because depending on your latitude, you might have less daytime than you do nighttime or more daytime than you do nighttime. Okay. Depending on where you are in latitude and the time of year. So that was quickly changed to say, hey, let's have 24 hours. And why 24? 24 is a great number for dividing things, right? If you had 10 hours in the day, you could say, okay, I've got 10, I can divide it into 5 2-hour chunks, or I can divide it into 2 5-hour chunks. And there aren't any other really good divisions that work with 10. But with 24, you can divide it into 2 12-hour chunks, you can divide it into 3 8-hour chunks, you can divide it into 4 6-hour chunks, you can divide it into 6 4-hour chunks, 8 3-hour chunks, and 12 2-hour chunks. Or of course, 24 1-hour chunks, right? So 24 is a great number for that. And the Babylonians loved the number 24. The only number they loved more than 24 was 60, because 60 is divisible by a whole heck of a lot more things. And you may have noticed we divide our hours into 60 minutes and our minutes into 60 seconds for the same reason. There have been proposals for metricizing time and basing it on units of 10. In general, those have failed because the length of the day is not always constant. The day actually changes length over time, believe it or not. And if you did break it down by tens, you would actually end up with the second being a slightly different length than the second that we know and love, and that all of our reference materials are based on, and that all of our physics and everything else is based around. Dan, you had a comment.
So I don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg, but mariners, you have to rely on time. And
For navigation.
Early on, 24 is divided up into 15 degrees, right?
Right.
Every 15 degrees is 1 hour, as longitude. And so that's where I always thought that 24 came in, because there's 24 times 15 is 360. And it's the mariners who that's been traveling the seas way before the clock came about. they needed a sure way of navigating, because that ocean is awfully big. And unless you know exactly where you were on the earth, it was impossible to get to your destination, right?
That's
And so,
correct.
that was heavily involved with the 24 equal periods, which was 15-degree increments of the
Of the 360-degree
360.
circumference or rate distance around the earth, right? So Dan points out that navigation probably played a big role in this definition of 24-hour periods, because an hour equates to 15 degrees as the earth is rotating. So the sun essentially moves 15 degrees in the sky every hour. So that's an interesting adaptation. And navigation does play a big part in time and why we do time the way that we do. And we'll actually talk about that a little bit as we go on. So at this point, we have defined the primary unit of time, which is the second, abbreviated with the letter S, in terms of a physical property of matter. So I don't know if you guys know, but if you ever wanted to know how long a meter actually was, there is actually a chunk of metal in France that is exactly 1 meter long by definition. The meter is the length of this chunk of metal.
Make sure
Okay.
you go there when it's room 10.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And so all of our other calculations about meters are based on that physical length. There is also
Still.
there is also a chunk of matter that is defined as 1 kilogram. That is a reference weight or a reference mass that is a physical object that you can look at. Those have also been categorized in terms of other physical properties of matter and light and things like that. So, but the second is defined as 9 billion 192,631,770 oscillations of an atom of cesium. So cesium has this property that it vibrates at this particular rate, right? And by counting those vibrations, we can figure out how long a second is in terms of that.
It takes quite the attention span to do that.
You have to be able to count really fast too. So that's it's definitely a factor. So what good is time if we can't measure it, right? The first clocks were invented in the 14th century BC, right? This is what, 3,600 years ago, something like that. These clocks used dripping or flowing water to measure the passage of time. So by having a valve that was open a specific amount or an opening that was a specific size, water would move through that opening at a specific rate. And based on that, you could calculate the passage of time. All right. Later clocks used sand in a similar fashion, and we've all played with an hourglass before. An hourglass was basically a container with sand in it, the sand all of a uniform size, that had a little tiny hole in one end of it, and gravity would pull the sand through that hole. But because of the size of the hole and the size of the sand, it would take a certain amount of time for that sand to flow through there. And an hourglass was by definition a glass that took 1 hour for the sand to go from the top compartment to the bottom compartment. So if you were keeping track of time, for example, you were a sentry on duty or something, and your shift was 4 hours, one of your things was to watch the hourglass and flip it over every hour, so that when you had flipped it 4 times, you knew your shift was over and the next guy had better be there, right? Eventually, we developed these things that are called escapements, which are designed to limit or restrict the speed of a physical object moving. And so you'll see these things that in a clock, if you ever take apart a clock, who's ever taken a clock apart before? Yeah, everybody's hand goes up, right? Who's ever put a clock back together again successfully? That's exactly what I thought. My mom's when she passed away, she still had a clock that I had not put back together. So, oh well, that's the way it goes. But inside the clock, there is an escapement mechanism which is designed through a property of whatever is inside the clock, either a pendulum or a spring or something like that, that will only let the wheel move a certain amount each period of time that it takes for the pendulum to oscillate or for the spring to cycle. And based on that and an appropriate number of gears, you can set up a clock face that will measure the passage of time. Dan.
Now, the shortest time that has ever been measured, and you can probably test it out yourself, is the time when the light turns green and the horn honks behind you.
Dan's comment is that the shortest measurable amount of time is the time between when the light turns green and the guy behind you starts honking. So,
And for some reason, it's a shorter period on the East Coast.
and Paul states it's a shorter period of time on the East Coast for whatever reason. We're not going to go into those reasons, but so the ultimate development in timekeeping is the atomic clock. The atomic clock was initially invented or first built in 1949. This particular example was developed in 1955 by Louis Essen. He's the guy on the right at the UK National Physics Lab. And it used microwave radiation applied to cesium atoms and counted the oscillations of those cesium atoms and used that to keep track of time. So this is an early 1955 atomic clock. You can see you wouldn't want to strap one of these to your wrist and carry it around with you, right? But we've obviously made advances in atomic clocks, but you still, do you want to carry decaying cesium around on your wrist wherever you go? Well, some people carry radium, I guess, but personally, I prefer to stay away from ionizing radiation. So, all right. So coordination of time. Originally, time of day was a completely local phenomenon, right? If you had two separate towns that were 50 miles apart, noon at one town was not the same time as noon at the other town. Okay. That's because the sun moves overhead. And so when it's overhead here, it's not overhead over here. And when it moves to be overhead over there, it's no longer overhead over here, right? So if you think about that, that's probably good enough for most things that you're doing. You only care what time it is where you're at, right? I care what time it is when I'm about to have lunch. And if lunch isn't ready, then I'm not happy. But I don't really care what time it is when my dad is having lunch in Delaware, because that's his problem, right? He's the one who cares about if his lunch is on time. So this was good enough for a long time until a long time. Oh my gosh. The problem started when we developed the ability to travel quickly, specifically with railroads, but in general terms, just being able to travel quickly. When people had to walk everywhere and it took you an hour or 2 hours to go from place to place, you didn't really care what time you left or what time you got there, as long as you got there in the daytime, for example. But with railroads, so a railroad is a limited resource, right? Only one train can use a particular piece of track at a time. There we go again, at a time. So
Unless they're going in the same direction.
the same piece of track, not the same block, but the same piece of track. And even then, I would say you probably don't want to have two trains on the same block at the same time, even if they're going the same direction. Because what if the train behind is going faster than the train in front, or the train in front has to stop for some reason? Anyway, we're not going to talk about the block system or how trains keep from running into each other. But the big problem was the railroad needed to keep to a schedule. And they needed to be able to say, we're leaving town X at such and such a time, and we will arrive in town Y at such and such a time. Because what if you had to make a connection to a second train? You needed to make sure that the first train was going to be where you needed to be before the second train left. And so you had to actually keep track of that. And originally the railroads made great efforts to keep track of local time at every place that they went. And that was a total nightmare, as you can imagine. And so what they did was they said, nope, this isn't going to work. What we need to do is we need to get it together and figure out how we're going to do this, not just locally, but worldwide. And an international coalition defined the standardized time zones, 24 time zones around the earth in 1884. About 25 countries had representatives get together and they figured this out. They figured out how they were going to split up time and what the width of a time zone was going to be. And they figured, well, let's make it 1 hour because it presumably came from the navigators, right? And they said, let's do this and we'll set these up so that a given time zone will be dependent on where you are physically, right? And so that was great. And they got together and they said, we're going to have a definitive zero time place, which is going to happen to be the location of the prime meridian or meridian zero, which goes through Greenwich, England. I'm assuming that was because of the navigators as well, because all the maps were based on that, right? And so they set up this, what they call coordinated universal time. Now, everybody says, why is it UTC if it's coordinated universal time? Shouldn't it be CUT? Well, in French, coordinated universal time is universal time coordinate or something weird like that, right? So my French is so bad. I haven't done French since high school, and I'm probably really bad at it now, but my pronunciation is probably way off. But January 1st, 1972, they set up this coordinated universal time, and that replaced the original GMT or Greenwich Mean Time. So we always talk about GMT time. We really should be talking about UTC or coordinated universal time. Dan.
And for you Unix people out there, everybody knows that the UTC, if you do a Unix time on a computer, you get a big number. And those are the number of seconds from January 1, 1972 until now.
It's actually 1970.
Or 1970, yeah. Now, why do they do 70?
My understanding is, so Unix originally was written in the 60s, the late 60s. And my understanding is that when they switched to coordinated universal time, there was a desire to be able to show times in the past as well as times in the future. And so they picked the nearest 10 divisible by 10 decade, right? Yeah. So, but yeah, it's January, the Unix time is based off of number of seconds since January 1st, 1970, which causes an interesting problem for Unix users because in 2038, on a particular date and time, the number of seconds will exceed the value that can be kept in a 4-byte number. And all the Unix clocks will suddenly decide that it's 1970 again. So if you guys ever had any issues during the Y2K thing, there's going to be a whole big thing going on in around 2038. So in fact, that's my retirement plan, is to do a lot of embedded programming in the couple of years before 2038. So anyway, let's move on. So who manages time today? Various international organizations maintain atomic clocks, and they're synchronized and managed by the ITU. Now, we all know who the ITU is, right? It's the International Telecommunications Union, and it also is responsible for coordinating radio frequencies. And so we are in ITU Region 2 here. Region 1 is Europe, and Region 3 is Asia Pacific, right? So the ITU keeps track of that and regulates that. And here in the US, the WWV radio station, which is currently in Fort Collins, Colorado, was set up to transmit a regular time signal that can be received by anyone and used to set their local clocks. And then later a second station, WWVH, was added in Hawaii. You can receive the WWV signal via radio on 5, 10, 15, 2.5, and 20 megahertz. Or you can make a phone call to that number for WWV or that other number for WWVH. Those are not toll-free calls, those are toll calls, but everybody with a cell phone nowadays doesn't really care about that, right? Paul?
There's also WWVB.
There is WWVB, and we're gonna talk about that.
Okay.
If you guys are curious, I happen to have the SDR here, and we can tune in to WWVH. And let me see if I can turn on the audio. There's a little lightning out there, sounds like. We're gonna wait for the 20 more seconds of this.
At the tone, 0 hours, 59 minutes, coordinated universal time.
Okay. Now, is that gonna be accurate? Well, probably not, because remember, that's being received by radio by a web SDR sitting up in Corinne, and then coming back to us via the internet. And so it's not entirely accurate. So let me see.
Plus, I think it's so cute that you think that these people manage time. My wife tells me what time it is.
Right. Okay.
It's time for you to do this.
Yes, Paul.
A lot of new handhelds that have wideband receive coverage can receive WWV. If you set up a memory for it, in the wideband coverage portion of it, you could set it for all those frequencies and have a source of it in the field. And I don't know about all of them, but this one, and I think some of the ASICs use a ferrite bar antenna. So you don't even have to have a long wire on it to receive that.
Yeah, my THF6 has a wideband receiver with a ferrite antenna as well. Paul points out that a lot of amateur radios with wideband receivers can receive WWV, the WWV signal, and because they can tune to these frequencies and be able to pick those up. So if you're out in the field, you can get a source of time. Now, the latency, if you call from a landline, it's about 100 milliseconds. And if you're listening to it on the radio, you've got to keep in mind the distance between here and Fort Collins and calculate what your offset would be, but it's in the milliseconds, right? So I think it was 15 milliseconds or something like that last time I looked at it. So that's something that you can do. When you want to set your clock, how accurate do you need to be, right? We're going to talk about accuracy of clocks as well as we go through, but as you listen to that signal, you hear a bunch of different things. And so this is what's actually in that signal. And I found this super interesting to just listen to how this signal goes across. There is the station ID, that's where he says that this is WWV. And then there's a 440 hertz tick or beep that is given off at the top of every minute, right? And what that is a defined tone, and it's used for setting musical instruments, that particular 440 hertz. So you can actually tune your piano to WWV if you know what you're doing. There's also different information that's included as you go around the clock, right? So each minute, if you look at this little box on the right here, there's a special announcement or this 500 hertz tone that's continuous from the start of the minute until about 45 seconds in. Then it's silent. And then there's the UTC voice announcement. Then there's this tone that kicks off. It looks like it's also a 600 hertz tone. Then there's some silence, and then it kicks on to the next announcement, right? And so it goes through this as it goes around the clock. And you hear those ticks. Those ticks are given every second. And then the beep is at the 0 time point, the 0 seconds, okay? Now, underlying all of that on, what is it? It's, the subaudible carrier. On a 100 hertz subaudible carrier, there is a binary coded decimal sequence of bits that will give you the time digitally. So you don't have to sit and listen for the beep all the time, and you don't have to try to programmatically decode the voice announcement to figure out what time it is. If you've got the appropriate hardware, you can pull this number in off of the subaudible tone and get the BCD coded timestamp information.
Is that
Now,
where they get the atomic clock watches
yes,
from? That?
although they usually use WWVB, which we'll talk about in a minute. But does anybody know what BCD is, binary coded decimal? So with binary coded decimal, normally in a decimal number, a binary number, you've got 8 bits per byte, right? And those 8 bits will encode a number from 0 to 255, okay? Because binary 8 bits gives you 256 possible values. So that with 0 being one of those values, the highest will be 255. What BCD does is it breaks that 8 bits up into 2 4-bit chunks, and each 4-bit chunk denotes a specific decimal digit. So it will only be the numbers 0 through 9 encoded in those 4 bits. Now 4 bits is enough to give you 16 values. So you could go from 0 to 15, but with binary coded decimal, it goes 0 through 9. So those higher bits aren't used, right? And so if you look at a binary coded decimal sequence of bits coming across, you can pick out the 4-bit chunks and convert those into decimal numbers. And if you've done it before, it's really not too hard to do that in real time while you're just sitting there looking at it, because it's fairly easy to convert the numbers 0 through 9 in binary up to whatever you want. Now, when you start getting into like binary numbers, figuring out what's 251 versus 263 or 243 or whatever, that's a lot harder. But because you're only looking at 4 bits, it's really pretty easy to do. So that number is actually binary coded decimal. If you've ever worked on a VAX computer, a digital equipment VAX, the VAX instruction set actually included instructions to work on BCD numbers, like add them and subtract them and multiply them and divide them and stuff. So it was actually pretty cool. It was definitely not a RISC system. It was the epitome of the CISC, or complex instruction set computer system. But there's actually a lot of stuff encoded in that signal. So what about WWVB? So WWVB transmits a signal at 60 kilohertz, and this transmitted signal used to have a certain type of information in it, but they changed what it had in it in 2012. So older hardware that depended on that old signal from before 2012 doesn't work anymore. And if you ever had, like if you bought one of those atomic watches that set itself from the WWVB time signal back in the 70s or 80s, it's not going to work now because the signal has changed. What WWVB puts out is different now. But there are implementations that will decode this WWVB signal. And this code that I found, in fact, is some freely available code that will do that using Google Radio or software-defined radio. That code hasn't been touched in over 9 years. So take it with a grain of salt. It may have sneaky bugs in there that cause problems. Yes, Kevin.
Can I back up just a little bit? What is the, for local conversion, what is the difference between UTC and local daylight?
So for Mountain Daylight Time at 6 hours, we're at -6.
-6.
Yeah, so you take GMT, you subtract 6, and that's where we're at right now. Standard time is 7. -7 for us.
So when you heard that live a few moments ago, it was announcing 0 hours, 59 minutes, and we were in the 6 o'clock hour. So they are 6 hours ahead of us.
Yeah.
Is that the same for GMT?
GMT actually changes with daylight savings time, believe it or not.
Yeah.
They have daylight savings time in England, and so the GMT can actually change. But if GMT is on standard time, then yes, it is the same. And I'm not sure, different countries decide to go to daylight savings time and standard time at different times. So I'm not sure if they're doing GMT equivalent to UTC right now, or if it's 1 hour off.
On the morning of November 3rd, when we go to standard time, we will then be 7 hours.
Yes. And for some ungodly reason, there's a push to keep us on daylight savings time all the time, which I think if we're going to settle on a particular standard, we should probably settle on standard time. But that's just my feelings. Anyway, details on WWVB are on this website here. You can go there and read all about how it works and what's encoded in the signal and how to keep track of time using that signal if you want to. It is all there. I'm not going to dig into that any further than that. All right. What about GPS? So the Global Positioning System, or GPS, was first developed in 1973 by the Department of Defense, and the first satellite was launched in 1978. The system was not fully deployed until 1993 when the 24th satellite went up, and that was when the system was considered fully deployed and online. It's managed by the United States Space Force, which is based in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Used to be managed by the Air Force, but somebody decided we needed a separate service for spacey stuff. So now we have the Space Force. GPS is primarily intended for global navigation. And in fact, it was primarily intended for military navigation. And somebody said, well, gee, if we're going to be doing military navigation with this system, it wouldn't take much to be able to do civilian navigation as well. Let's just go ahead and include that. And so GPS satellites actually have two separate systems on board. One that is used only by the military and one that is used for civilian use. And originally, that civilian system was doctored or adjusted to have less accuracy than the military system. And then at some point, I think it was in the mid 1990s, yeah, they decided, people actually want to use this. It's actually a really good thing for people to be able to do this. Let's turn off that ambiguation signal. And so the GPS got a lot more accurate at that point. The civilian GPS got a lot more accurate. They do reserve the right to turn that back on at any time or to turn off the civilian signal entirely, which is why other countries have developed their own systems. We're going to talk about them in a minute. But for GPS, it's primarily intended for global navigation. Each satellite has an atomic clock on board the satellite, and each transmits a very accurate signal of the current time and a representation of its location. And your GPS receiver uses that information to calculate its own position, and it can show very accurate time as a side effect of having that accurate time coming from the satellites. Now, physics plays a role in this. You guys are familiar with the whole Einstein general relativity stuff. Those clocks in the satellites are moving faster than clocks here on Earth. And so time is actually slower for them in their orbit than it is here. So the length of a measured second as transmitted by these clocks in the satellites is calculated based on the known speed of the satellite, so that we receive a corrected signal here on the Earth. So
the little guy counting cesium atoms. That's
yeah, the little guy of counting cesium cycles, he actually has a different table to look at based on how fast the satellite's going. And some of these satellites are in higher orbits, some are in lower orbits, some are in different orbits that go around. The goal of having a constellation is that you can always see, at least you always can see more than one satellite. And if you've got 3 satellites, you can get a 2-dimensional fix. If you've got 4 satellites, you can get a 3-dimensional fix for where you are physically. If you can see 1 satellite, you can get the time. So that's an interesting point. Okay. Other countries didn't like being dependent on the US for all of their navigation and time. And so they developed their own systems. The Chinese developed a system called Beidou, which became operational in 2020. The Europeans developed a system called Galileo, which became operational in 2016. Japan had Japanese. That should be Japanese. I thought I fixed that, but apparently I did not. Should be Japanese. They have a system called QZSS, which is mostly usable in Asia. The way the orbits are arranged, it doesn't provide as good a coverage outside of the Asia region, but that's a Japanese system. Same thing for IRNSS, the Indian system. It mostly provides coverage in Southeast Asia, right? So it's not necessarily a fully worldwide system. It is available worldwide, but it's not necessarily fully accurate worldwide. And then GLONASS is the Russian system. Modern GPS receivers, like the one in your phone, can actually receive multiple systems signals and make the calculations on all of those systems. And based on that, they can get you a pretty darn accurate position of where you're at. Okay.
My $300 GPS, it uses GLONASS
Does it?
as well as the US
Galileo
version
and
WAS, what do you call it? I can't remember. the
so
name.
WAS is another system that provides, it's kind of differential GPS. It's more important for navigation than for timekeeping. But why do we as hams care what time it is? There's a song. Does anyone really know what time it is? Does anyone really care? We care because of a few reasons. Scheduling. When you want to have a regular contact with someone, it's really helpful to know when that regular contact is going to be and to have a common idea between the two of you of when that contact is going to be. If my clock is off by 5 minutes and your clock is off by 5 minutes in the other direction, we might miss each other entirely, right? Logging, you want to keep accurate logs of your contacts, including the time, date, and duration of your contacts. And band selection and properties, different bands have different properties depending on the time of day. So if you know what time it is, you can make a better decision on what band you want to use for a particular contact or particular purpose. And also some digital modes are time sensitive. For example, JS8 and FT8, they actually are time sliced protocols. And so they are dependent on being somewhat accurate. They don't have to be accurate to the millisecond. They can be off by even a couple of seconds and still work, but they do care about the time. And so it's very helpful if you have your clock synchronized when you're using JS8 or FT8. Dan.
So not only hams, but in the networking world, time is of the essence, as the saying goes. Your ISPs, they all deal with Stratum 1 clocks. Their routers, they're cesium based. And what you want to do is you want to sync up to the most accurate clock that you have. Even PBXs, everything that goes on the network relies on time.
We're going to talk about that a little bit.
Say it.
We're going to talk about that a little bit too.
Shutting up.
Okay, so that's why we care, right? It is kind of important. So how do we keep track of time in the shack? First step is get a good clock. You want a clock that's large enough to see clearly from where you're operating at. So your operating location, right? You want to be able to see the clock from there. Digital or analog doesn't matter, whatever you like best. A 24-hour display is helpful because remember, we are talking as hams, we're talking to people all over the world, and some people may be in a completely different time zone from us. An interesting thing about time zones, the time zone in India is 11.5 hours different from the time zone here. So it's not 11 hours, it's 11.5 hours different.
And Newfoundland time is a half hour.
And Newfoundland is, there's even a time zone that's like 15 minutes offset from neighboring time zones. So time zones are interesting and you need to pay attention to that. There has also been discussion about doing away with time zones and just letting everybody use UTC for everything, which I'm not necessarily opposed to, but there would be a lot of confusion as people adapt to getting up at 1800 hours and going to bed at 1,500 hours or whatever it is. So
Are they going to get up?
anyway, so look for a 24-hour clock or a clock that is readily able to be set to where you can tell the difference between 24-hour periods. You want ideally a clock that has both local time and UTC. You might need two clocks for this, right? If you have an analog clock like our lovely clock on the wall, I'd need two clocks to be able to see local time and UTC. If I happened to be over at the EOC over at Station 83, I have four clocks on the wall that always show the same time. So they're actually drawn on pie plates, so or paper plates. So they're not they're only accurate twice a day, but they
I don't think they're there anymore.
No,
They-
they took them off.
did they get rid of them?
Yes.
Oh man. Oh.
And UTC requires a 24-hour.
UTC requires a 24-hour clock. So you want to have probably two clocks if you're working with analog time, or even it's hard to find a digital clock publicly available that's not on a computer that displays two separate times at the same time. I've seen them that show one time zone and then switch to another time zone that switch back and forth, but it's not common to find one that actually has two clock faces on it. You do want accurate timekeeping, and
Those are
they're
the people I've seen.
what's that?
MFJ,
They have one that does
Yeah.
that. Yeah, they would, but they're going out of business anyway. So
Some of the early digital watches had an analog watch with
and a digital clock as well. Yes, and you can set them to different
There's
times.
still a few that
There are some that will still do that. And smartwatches, you can get a watch face that has multiple time zones displayed on it. So that's something that you can do.
There are some situations where your timing is controlled. Your computer network access to you and so on, it's all governed by the provider. You have to say your timing off of their timing.
Yeah. We'll actually talk about that in regards to cell phones in a few minutes. So, but that is a good point. So accurate timekeeping is somewhat important for our shack. It doesn't have to be, like I said, down to the millisecond, but you want to be pretty close if you can. All right, so here's just some example clocks. I've got a 12-hour, well, actually, there's a couple of 24-hour analog clocks. One of them has the PM hours in inset, and the other one actually has 24 slots around the circle. So that will freak you out if you're used to looking at time on an analog clock, because the hands won't be in the position you're expecting them to be in. So that the clocks that we had in missile launch centers were this type of clock that were 24-hour clocks with 24 separate times around the circle. And you have to get used to looking at that. So it's not trivial to look at that.
Well, it would take 2 minutes for the second hand to get around too.
Right. Well, actually, no, the second hand, there's still 60 minutes around the circle. So it's just the hour hand that is half as fast, right? So the second hand and the minute hand move normally. And so that's also something that's confusing, right? Is because you're expecting the hands to be in a particular position or a particular shape to indicate a particular time, and they're not. And so you have to get used to that. There's a sample clock, a digital clock up here on the top right. The one below that is kind of a cool one. It's emulating a Nixie clock. So if you guys are familiar with Nixie tubes, these are tubes that had elements inside the tube that were specific for each number, each digit within a number. And the tube, you could turn on the different elements according to the number that was going to be displayed. Now, these tubes are still available from Russia, and they're not cheap. And they're all about this size. The bigger ones aren't available anymore. They're all about an inch tall now. So somebody had the bright idea of making a little board with an LCD type display on it. Actually, I think it's an LED and OLED display, and making it look like a Nixie clock tube. And so when they figured out how to do that, somebody quickly said, I'm going to take 6 of those and put them in a clock. And this was the end result. You can buy one of these for about $65. So it's on my want list. If you guys are looking for something to get me for Christmas, I would definitely take one of those. On the bottom of the page, on the left side, I have a picture of the geochron. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. And on the bottom right, I have a picture of the ham clock, which we'll also talk about more in a minute. Okay, so
Jan,
yes.
I read something from a clock manufacturer that was in response to a question submitted by a customer about why clocks are always pictured in ads showing
Oh, a particular time?
10:10 a.m.
Yeah.
whatever. And apparently people subconsciously associate that shape with a smile.
Yeah. So if you look at the hands on these 2 clocks that are displayed, these 2 analog clocks, you'll see that they're both reflecting. The hands are in the same positions essentially, right? So
Your driver's ed teacher.
if you ever look at an ad for an Apple product, the time displayed on the Apple product will always be the same time. For similar reasons. I don't remember what the time is, but there is a standard time to show on a picture of like an Apple Watch or an Apple phone or something like that. So
And it really doesn't matter what is displayed on these analog bases, because I think there's about 1% of high school students that can read them.
they did do a thing I saw the other day about that, where they went around and asked people, what time does this say? Or set the hands on the clock to this time. And nobody got it. So yeah.
So you can take away the numbers.
Yeah.
Those of us in the ham radio demographic can still tell time.
A lot of us are older gentlemen, that's true. So we can still tell time even if the numbers aren't on the clock. All right. So let's talk about the geochron. The geochron, I would consider this to be the Cadillac of clocks, right? This thing, they make both a mechanical version, which is freaking awesome, also costs about $3,000, and they make a digital version, which costs about $500. And it's a little box that plugs into the back of your monitor or TV or something. And it presents this beautiful image of the world with a representation of the sun. And during the day, the earth moves along underneath that sun display. So you can always see where the time is and who has sunlight and who has nighttime. And during the year, that sun pattern changes depending on the season as well. So it not only reflects, it accurately reflects where the sunlight line is, the terminator line is during the year. And it's really amazing. It's beautiful. It's really expensive. The digital versions can actually overlay other information on there, like current weather information about radio propagation, all kinds of stuff. You can have your airplane flights displayed on there. There's tons of stuff you can put on the digital version. It updates its time automatically over the internet. The digital one costs about $500. You have to pay a fee again for every overlay that you want to put on that. They're making bank on these things, right? I know of one guy who has one of the guys on the Wave Talker list, and he has it set up as his background when he's on Zoom calls. So the world clock or the geochron clock is behind him. So ham clock is another thing that's available. And let me see if I can drag this out of the way so you can get the full effect. So ham clock is a thing that is also available. It has similar capabilities to geochron, and it is free software with free updates. I actually put up a port forward for this so you can see it live, and I'll just pop this up. Maybe I will. Well, I'll try to pop it up. How about that?
Lost all your cesium atoms.
My cesium atoms have gone for a trip, unable to connect. Oh, darn. Well, I may have gotten a different IP address when we had that power outage the other day. That's unfortunate. I was going to show that in the in the presentation,
I like
but
the part number.
at 4, 3, 2, 1, it's very secure. If I get this back online, which I will at some point, I will send out an email about that. Let's see if I can get back to my presentation now. I'm gonna have to drag this back over. Okay, go away. I don't want that. I want that. Okay, there we go. So it has similar capabilities to Geochron. It is free software. There's also a company called Innovato that sells a little tiny computer called a Quadra that is about that big. For about $50, you can get one. And it has ham clock pre-installed on it, ready to go. Plug it in, turn it on. You can set up your Wi-Fi on it through the TV screen. And it's pretty darn cool. You can control things like what shows up here in the corner up here. I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but up where I have the sun right now, it can actually change those dynamically, like every 30 seconds or every 45 seconds. I would have loved to have shown you all of this in a live demo of mine, but unfortunately I can't do that. But you can change like the colors, you can change all the different stuff, you can change what displays in each of these little sub windows. It's very capable and it's very free, which personally I'm a big fan of free. That's one of my favorite prices to pay for stuff. So I would definitely recommend, if you're interested in the Geochron and you've got 500 disposable dollars that you don't want to spend on a radio, go ahead and buy one and let me come and look at it and drool over it. But if you don't, for $50, you can get Innovato Quadra with ham clock already pre-installed, and it works pretty darn well.
Is that like the little Raspberry type?
It's an ARM-based computer on a chip, similar to a Raspberry Pi, but you don't have to build it. You don't have to buy a case for it. You don't have to find all the parts for it. It's all right there, ready to go. You just plug it in and turn it on, and off you go.
So is there a Zoom background that looks like Geochron, so you can?
I haven't found one. I bet you could make one though. In fact, you could probably make one out of the output of ham clock so that it actually updates. But again, I haven't tried to do that. It's not been one of my top priorities, but it would be kind of cool to have that up on behind you on your Zoom, right? All right. So does your computer have an accurate clock? If you are curious if your computer has an accurate clock, point your web browser at time.is and it will show you the current time and how close it thinks your computer time is to the actual time. Let's go ahead and do that. Time.is says, my time is exact. I am plus 0.002 seconds from the actual time. So I'm pretty darn close. My computer is running NTP, and so it is keeping track of time. We're going to talk about NTP in a few minutes. But yeah, time.is will pop this up. It's kind of cool.
You think they're looking at milliseconds? I think that's just a rounding error.
It probably is. I don't know. But yeah. What do you do if your computer does not have accurate time? You want to run some kind of timekeeping software. We're going to talk about that. All right. So how do computers and clocks keep time? Well, if you have a clock that's plugged into the wall, the power company is very careful. What? Somebody has a comment? Ragnar, is that you?
No,
Yeah.
it's not me.
Okay. Somebody was breaking in there. Okay, so the power company is very careful to deliver you power at 60 hertz. At least they try to do that. They're not always 100% successful in that, but they try to do that. And so clocks that plug into the wall can use that information to count the time as they do their thing, right? And so you set the clock to a specific time and it will update based on this 60 hertz power signal. So that's kind of cool. Clocks in like large buildings, like schools. Every school has a jillion clocks in it, right? Because you have to know when the bell's going to ring in class. And so every classroom has a clock. There's clocks in the hallway. There's clocks in the gym. There's clocks in the lunchroom. Those clocks are all synchronized. And the way that they do that is those clocks are all running independently, but at the top of every hour, there's a little electromagnet inside the clock, and a pulse sent from the office pulls every clock to the minute hand to the top of the hour at a given moment. And so they always stay pretty well synchronized throughout the day. It's kind of cool.
I have a comment.
Yes, Ragnar, go ahead.
I worked at Grand Canyon at the North Rim for a couple of months. And if you had a regular clock, every hour would show 50 minutes. And they told me it was cheaper to run 50 cycle power than it was 60. So that was the reason they ran that. So I found it kind of interesting.
Interesting. Yeah. In Europe, their power runs on 50 hertz as well. So a European clock that plugs into the wall will not keep accurate time in the US because it'll be based on a 50 hertz signal instead of a 60 hertz signal. So that's kind of interesting to know. I didn't realize we had anybody doing that here in the US, but apparently at Grand Canyon they do. Your watch or your clock may be quartz controlled or crystal controlled. You'll typically have a quartz crystal embedded inside the device, and quartz vibrates at 32,768 hertz. And so these electronics in the system can count those vibrations and advance the clock accordingly. So if you have a watch that says quartz controlled, it's using the presence of that quartz crystal inside the device to count the time. Dan.
Had I known we were gonna do clocks, I would have brought my Bulova. I have a precisionist Bulova, which has a 262 kilohertz oscillator in there. And it's accurate to about a second every 6 months.
So what's the problem with a quartz crystal? Paul?
Actually, 32,768 is not a inherent characteristic of quartz. They have to grind the crystal to the right size and shape.
The crystal has to be the right shape.
And they age over time.
And crystals do age over time. And it's also temperature sensitive as well. So the clock may be slightly fast or slightly slow, depending on if it's hot out or cold out. So that's something to keep in mind. They usually, your crystal controlled watches or clocks will be fairly accurate, but they will not be perfectly accurate. Okay. So that is something to keep in mind. Your computers, a lot of computers have a real-time clock piece of circuitry on the system, on the board. And if you ever look in your computer and you see that it has a little button cell or a lithium cell in there, it's not only keeping your CMOS configuration for your BIOS, it is also probably running the real-time clock that's inside your computer. So I know Paul has an old computer where the battery died, and he had to replace that with some kind of jangled up jury-rigged variant that ran off of AA batteries or something.
And it still works great.
And it works. So, you know,
we
we do what we do, right? So back in the day before that, when you booted up a PC for the first time every day, it would ask you, what's the date and time? Because it had no idea, and you had to key it in as the machine was booting up. So nowadays, computers usually have that built in. Raspberry Pis do not have an RTC clock by default. It's not on the board. So there are daughter boards you can get for a Raspberry Pi that include that clock chip that will do that for you. These chips or circuits use a phase lock loop or a PLL, which is a dynamically self-adjusting circuit to reduce the errors in that. And it's based on the properties of the frequency that things are going through, and it throws away the high frequency spikes and things like that. It keeps only the low frequency things, and it self-reinforces itself to try to keep as accurate a time as possible. Is it perfect? No, it is not. Quite often you will see that your computer clocks are drifting, and that is something that we will talk about dealing with right now. So how do we synchronize that time so that we're not caught with our clocks being off kilter from what they really should be? Well, computers on a network can use a protocol called NTP or SNNTP. NTP is the network time protocol, and SNTP is the simple network time protocol. And they can use those protocols, one or the other, to set the time. So SNTP uses only a single source. So you tell it, go get the time from this place, and it will figure out the time at that place, that system, other computer on the network, and it will calculate the difference between where it is and where that is, and it will set the time to a specific thing, right? But an SNTP system cannot be a time server because it's not running all the time. It's something that you run like once an hour or once a day or something like that to step your time to the correct value. NTP can work in two ways. You can use the NTP protocol in the same way as SNTP. You can run it and say, there's a command called NTP date you can run, and you give it some list of time servers, and it will talk to all of them and figure out what the time is based on what they all say. And then it will step your clock. Or you can run it continuously as what we call a daemon process, or a process that's not attached to a terminal, not a process that you're looking at on the screen. And when you do that, it will actually watch your system's clock and the time that it's getting from these other sources, and it will adjust your system clock to be more accurate, which is really kind of cool. Now, that's great as far as it goes, but as soon as you turn your computer off, it forgets all of that information and you have to start over again. So, you know,
Is that where they set their, to get their clocking external versus internal?
Kind of, yeah. I think that would be a good way to describe it. If the clock is internal, it's using the clock, the onboard clock, right?
Right.
And if it's calculated this offset or this adjusted clock rate correctly, it can be pretty accurate. Because it's based on,
Customers, no, they get slips.
Yeah.
Because they have the timing set internally rather than externally, because it's vital that they do get their clock. in
Right.
and timing off the system.
yeah, so we'll talk a little bit more about that as we talk about how does NTP get the time. But yeah, so that's, you can have an external time source. And we'll talk about that in a second. So obviously the way you want to run NTP, if you have the resources, is to run it continuously on your machine so that it's always keeping track of the time and it's modifying your system's clock to be more accurate. Okay. Linux and macOS typically have NTPD already installed and already configured. There's another implementation called Crony that you can use that is compatible with NTP. It's just uses a different configuration setup and things like that. There are several different packages available for Windows beyond the built-in SNTP client. So if you go into Windows clock setting utility, it has a spot where it says set the clock automatically, and you can give it the name of a clock server. And it's going to use SNTP to talk to that time server and figure out what the time should be. And they'll usually do that once a day or something like that. So it'll be fairly accurate. But if you run a program like Dimension 4 or TimeSync or NetTime or Meinberg NTP, those are full NTP implementations that will run continuously on your Windows machine and work just like NTP would do on a Linux or Mac OS machine. All right. So how does NTP work? So NTP uses a concept of a stratum or level. If you think about this as a kind of tiered system, your stratum 0 is a accurate clock, like an atomic clock, or the GPS is going to be stratum 0. Okay. Stratum 1 servers are computers that are directly connected to an accurate source of time. So they're either connected to an atomic clock or they're connected to some way that gets time either via WWVB or from GPS. Dan.
Where did you get this information? The Stratum 1 does not receive it is the source. Stratum 1 does not, it is the cesium clock.
No, the Stratum 1 is the software, NTP software that's running on the computer. The computer is running at Stratum 1. Stratum 0 is the time source. Trust me on this. I've worked with NTP for decades.
Well, I worked with Stratum 1 clocks for decades.
Are they physical atomic clocks or are they computers attached to atomic clocks?
They are not a computer.
Are you sure?
I'm gonna put that on the shelf.
Okay.
And do some.
Let's talk about it after. Let's talk about it after. Okay, so Stratum 2 servers get their time from Stratum 1 servers. So they're 2 hops away from the actual clock. And then Stratum 3 would be the next level down, goes all the way down to Stratum 16. Okay. Back in the old days of the internet, it was considered acceptable to run a few time servers on your network at Stratum 2 or Stratum 3 that provided time to other machines at your location. And those machines would be running at Stratum 4, for example. There's a list of public or open Stratum 1 and Stratum 2 clocks out on the internet that you can get at and get a list of those clocks. Back in the day, a lot of the Stratum 1 clocks restricted who could connect to them because there's only so many connections that they can work with. But there are other ways to configure it now that don't require a peering relationship between the 2 clocks. They can use it strictly as a server and do the calculations based on that. So it's less critical nowadays, but yeah, you can actually find some Stratum 1 and Stratum 2 servers out there.
And Jan, you are correct.
Okay, I thought so, but nice to hear it confirmed. So there are still some public time servers out there. Most people who care about accurate time are going to get a GPS receiver and hook that up to their computer. And so they'll be running a Stratum 1 server on their computer because the GPS receiver will act as a Stratum 0 accurate clock. Okay. Most PC and Mac OS systems don't run an NTP server continuously. They check and update their time periodically using either that SNTP protocol or the NTP protocol. And while this is usually good enough, it doesn't take advantage of the ability of the NTP software to skew the passage of time on the system clock, which a continuously running NTP service can do, which ultimately makes your clock more accurate. Okay, so if you are looking at a machine that is running NTP and you run the NTPQ command and ask it for its peers, it will give you a list of the clocks that it's talking to. And so what you can see in this list, this is taken from this laptop, okay? It has a bunch of clocks that are in this Ubuntu pool, which are tagged as pool reference IDs. And you'll see they're all at Stratum 16. That third column over is the Stratum. They are not providing time. Okay. So they're considered not accurate at this point. And then the when column shows the last time that it successfully talked to that clock. So if you look at the leftmost column where it says remote, that's the IP address of the clock. Okay. And I didn't have it put I did -N on the command so that it wouldn't show the names because the names are all going to be truncated so they fit within these columns. But this will actually show you the IP addresses. And you'll see some of these have a little minus sign next to them. Some of them have a little plus sign, and one of them has an asterisk. The one with the asterisk is the one that I'm currently chiming with. And they call it chiming when you're synchronized to that clock or you're tied to that clock, right? So you're chiming with one. The ones with the plus are kind of my next choice. If that one that I'm currently chiming with goes away for some reason or gets bad, I'm going to switch to one of those with the plus because I have good solid connectivity with them. I know what they're doing. You'll also see on here the poll, which is the number of milliseconds I wait before I ask it again. And then you'll see a reachability column. And one thing you'll notice on here, remember, this is a laptop. It gets turned off and on all the time. Every time I close the lid, it suspends, right? So the reachability is indicating out of the times that I've tried to talk to this guy, how many times was I successful in talking to this guy? The best you will ever see is 377, which is an octal number. So remember, each digit in octal can be 0 through 7. So 377 is the highest 8-bit octal number you can represent, okay? And each bit of that 8-bit number is the last 8 times I tried to talk to that clock. So if I see this one that says 42, I can visually convert that in my head to the binary number one. What would it be? It'd be 1 0, 0, 1, 0. Right? 0, 1, 0. No, 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0. So I know that 2 times in the last 8 tries, I successfully talked to that guy, that 212 guy.
Okay, what's the minus sign and the no sign?
The minus sign, as I just said, is indicating that those are not choices that I would make if I was going to switch clocks that I'm chiming with. The pluses are the ones that I do want to talk to if my current chiming clock goes away. And the star is the guy that I'm currently chiming with.
What about the 7 from the bottom?
He's neither of the above. So he would be the next one to get the plus if I started chiming with one of my pluses and it became the star.
So 42 binary is 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0. I mean, that's why 42 is such a great number.
Okay.
1,
So
0, 1, 0,
so it's
1, 0.
alternating, right? Okay. You'll also see on here the calculated delay, offset, and jitter for these guys. And you'll note that that top one underneath the pool has a pretty high jitter, and that's probably why he's not one of my good candidates for using, right? Although this one here, 72, 30, 35, 88, also has a jitter of 3. But if you look at his, compare his delay and his offset, there's reasons why it picks the ones that it picks. Okay. And so this table basically tells you how good you're doing. Now, the reference ID is where that guy is getting his time from. So for these guys that are Stratum 2, that's the Stratum 1 clock that they're talking to. And the guy that's Stratum 3, that's the Stratum 2 clock that he's talking to. Remember, I'm chiming with a Stratum 2 clock, so I'm going to be at Stratum 3. All right. So if I go to the next page, you can also ask your NTP server for system info, which is what's my clock looking like? What's my NTP server seeing out there? And so you can see it says, hey, I'm here. I'm peering with 66, 220, 10, 2, which again was that guy on the bottom that has the star, the guy I'm chiming with. I'm in client mode with him. So I'm not peering. I'm just receiving time from him. I'm not giving him back the time that I'm keeping track of. So he could be delivering time to thousands of clients without any trouble. If I was peering with him, then he's got to know who I am and we're sending information back and forth. And that takes a lot more resources. So I'm just using him as he's my server, I'm the client. There are no leap seconds coming up. My leap indicator is 0. UTC does not have the concept of leap seconds. Does anybody know what leap seconds are? So as the Earth turns around, over time, we get off from the time measured by looking at where the sun is. And the leap seconds are added in order to synchronize us back up periodically. And they can only be added twice a year. They're not added every year. They're not added every time that they can be added. But those are things that are added periodically when we need that to get resynchronized with where the sun actually is.
Which is similar of why we use leap year.
Similar to leap days on a leap year, right? So there's no leap indicator. There's no leap event coming up. I'm running at Stratum 3. My precision is minus 23 log base 2. My delay is 36. These are all in microseconds. Okay. So 1,000 of these is a millisecond. And so you can see my calculations are such that I'm keeping track quite well of to where my time is. No, sorry, these are in milliseconds. So like if I look at my clock jitter, my jitter is 3 milliseconds, 3.14 milliseconds. My wander is indicating how my clock is not staying consistent, and it's less than a millisecond off. In fact, it's like 20% of a millisecond. So those are the pieces of information that you can glean from your NTP server if you have it running.
Could you go back to the previous screen? I want to get that of my peers. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so the NTPQ command is peers, and it will give you this list. Now, there's also a program called NTPDC, which you can use to control your NTP server. That is not normally installed by default. And it actually includes another peers command called LM peers, which is a version of this peers table that is the one that this guy named Mills likes. He's the guy who wrote NTP, so he has his own special layout of the peers table that he wanted. So you can actually look at his version of the peers table. NTPQ does not show me LM peers, but NTPDC will show me that. I don't have it installed, or I could show you that. Okay, so you can add a clock module to your NTP server to get time from your GPS receiver. And you can add a module to get time from a WWV receiver. One thing to keep track of or know about, the GPS signal is really accurate, and it can provide you with a what they call a PPS, or pulse per second, that will tell you when a second is ticking, right? And so it can use that information to keep your clock more accurate, your Stratum 1 clock more close to the Stratum 0 time that's coming off of the GPS receiver. But USB connected GPS receivers don't give you a PPS. And that's because there is significant delay in UPS processing. USB system pulls devices 1,000 times a second. The best accuracy you can get is 1 millisecond because of the way the GPS device is pulled. Now, there are GPS hats or daughter boards for Raspberry Pis that do not use a USB connection to talk to the computer. They use the GPIO ports to communicate with the computer, and they can give you a PPS and be significantly more accurate than a USB connected GPS receiver. Also, if you have your GPS device connected to a real serial port or a parallel port, you can get that PPS signal over that port and be much more accurate than a USB port. So I say on here, don't trust a USB serial port. How accurate do you need to be? Do you need to have millisecond accuracy? Probably not, but it's kind of cool to be able to do so. Once you get into timekeeping and NTP and start working with it and understanding how it works, you're like, man, I want my stuff to be as accurate as I could possibly make it. And so it's one of those rabbit holes that you can quickly fall down and get lost in. So just understand when you're using a GPS time source for your clock, even though your clock will say I'm at Stratum 1, it will not be as accurate as a clock that has a PPS signal coming into it, okay, or coming out of it. All right, what about my phone or my tablet? Most phone networks these days are based on the LTE or 5G system. And those systems care about what time it is because they are time division type systems, right? So as you're sending packets of data, they're digital, as you're sending packets of data to the cell phone tower, it cares about what time those packets are arriving and what time packets are being sent out. And so it needs to know what time it is. And so as a side effect of that, it needs to tell you what time it is, and it can tell you what time it is, and it does. And so your clock on your phone is actually pretty darn accurate, even if you don't have GPS. Now,
And that timing is derived from the telecom network.
from the telecom network, but you got to keep in mind too, the cell phone tower has a GPS receiver on it as well. So it's got essentially a Stratum 1 clock at the tower. So it knows what time it is. Yeah.
All I know is that their equipment has to sync off the phone.
Yeah,
Which
and they do sync with each other across the network as well. So If you want to get yourself an app for your phone that has a clock on it, there's a good one for Android called Ham Clock. And it can show you the local time and the UTC time. And it has a third spot where you can put in notes. Some people put their location or their grid coordinate or something like that in there, so that if they're doing making radio calls, they could just glance at their phone and see, oh, that's where I'm at. So when I'm giving my grid coordinate, I can just give it to them right off of there without having to remember what it is. There's a corresponding one for iOS called Ham Clock without a space. I don't have an iOS device, so I've never used that, but it has like a map on it and other kinds of stuff. So some people really like it. Some people don't care.
So if you have a little phone,
You could set that up, plug it in, run NTP on the phone. A lot of these phones have GPS receivers built into them. You could run an NTP server on your phone and have your phone be your Stratum 1 clock
well,
on your network.
I have a little phone that has a micro HDMI port. I could actually plug that into the back of my flat screen TV.
You could, and put this up on the TV. Sure, you could do that. So, yeah.
Always thinking.
Although I would recommend running Ham Clock instead because it's much cooler. But yeah, you could do something like that. Okay, there are also GPS and NTP appliances that you can buy. There's a company called CenterClick that makes these little boxes that are completely plug and play. You don't have to know anything to set this up. You don't have to know anything about NTP or how it works or any of that. You take this, you plug it in, you hook a GPS antenna up to it, and it provides you a Stratum 1 NTP server on your network. So these things cost a couple $100. So they are out there and available. And like I say, they're pretty much plug and play. They will even give you a pulse per second signal out of them, as you can see that PPS plug there that you can tap off and use for something else if you want to. So kind of cool. A lot of people really like these because you don't have to muck around with them. You don't have to configure it. You don't have to do anything with it except plug it in, turn it on. Or you can build your own setup with a Raspberry Pi, PoE board, and a GPS. And I found this blog post that describes doing this, which ultimately you can probably do this cheaper than buying the CenterClick clock, but this is more of a hobbyist solution than the CenterClick clock, right? So the CenterClick is, I want to buy an appliance that does this thing. This is, I want to play with electronics and make something that does something. And so what this guy did is he basically built this that is powered by PoE, so you don't have to have a separate power supply for your Raspberry Pi. You plug the network cable into your PoE router or switch, and it gets its power from there and its Ethernet from there. It has a GPS hat, potentially external antenna, or you can use the onboard antenna. Kind of a cool idea for not a super lot of money. So read that blog post if you're interested in seeing how that works. Okay, there is a module in the NTP server for receiving a WWV signal. And it uses an audio driver, and it actually decodes that BCD data that's in the subaudible tone. So even if you don't have a GPS, if you've got a computer with a sound card and you can want to dedicate a radio to it, you can pick up the WWV signal and feed it into your computer, and that's your Stratum 1 clock. You will want to set the propagation delay, and there's actually a place where in the NTP configuration where you define this WWV clock, you tell it in, I think it's milliseconds, what the propagation delay is between Fort Collins, Colorado, and where you are. So you need to figure that out yourself based on what kind of bounce you're getting and how far away it is and all that kind of stuff. So, but you can make that as accurate as you want. It's really kind of cool. It would be an interesting project to integrate an SDR with this code. As I think about more about that, your SDRs are probably USB connected and less likely to be able to deliver you a very accurate time signal from this. But it would be kind of cool anyway to do that and just say, just plug this in and turn it on, and there's your WWV signal and you're ready to roll. You don't need a separate radio or whatnot, right? I haven't found anybody who's done that yet. Okay, that's the end of the presentation. And it
Hey,
is.
we're out of time.
It is 8 o'clock, 8:02 actually, so we were a little bit late. But here's some references to time and clocks and things like that. You're welcome to get copies of this. I will have this posted on the website. If not tonight, then probably tomorrow or the next day. And these links will be clickable in that, so you don't have to necessarily memorize this or take a picture or whatever, but you're welcome to if you want to. But that's my presentation on time and clocks and whatnot. So any questions?
I just tried to download hand clock. It's not available for smartphones.
No, ham clock is not available for smartphones. It's only for Linux. There are people who, the source code is available. And there are people who've compiled it on PCs as before, so you could run it on a
There
PC.
was you had a slide that said it was available for Android and without a space for iOS.
That's a different ham clock. That's not the ham clock that has the map display and everything. That's a separate app. So if you go to the App Store on Android and search for ham clock, you'll find a ham clock app, but all it has is the 2 clocks on it, right?
Oh, okay.
So if you look at that.
Yeah, I was just curious if anyone had a smartphone clock.
So this is ham clock running on my phone. So it's not the same as the ham clock that competes with the geocron. Okay,
This
Yeah.
is,
What app is that?
this is ham clock on
You have
Android.
to- you have to configure it
That's
on the phone.
You just download it from the Play Store. Do you have an Android phone?
Yeah,
You should be able to find it in the Play Store.
no, it comes looking for a hand clock. This app isn't available for your device because it was made for an older version of Android.
That's been happening with a lot of things lately. Google is kind of cracking down on people, so it still runs on mine. But my device is a OnePlus 9. It's probably 3 years old. No, I don't know. You may be able to find the APK somewhere and sideload it. That's a possibility. You may be able to get it through like the Amazon App Store. But that's going to be an exercise for the student. So I wish you luck. And if you do figure it out, let me know. Jeff.
I read an article last year sometime that Donald Trump was going to shut down the WWV time service.
That is something that comes up periodically. And then everybody with a ship says, don't do that. And they don't do it. So it does come up periodically, and there has been movement towards getting rid of WWV. But then everybody says, well, what happens if GPS breaks or, somebody turns off the satellites or something? After I stop the recording, I can talk to you about a project that I was involved in when I worked at Raytheon that I don't want on the recording, but we can talk about it after. So other questions, anybody from the peanut gallery?
WWVB did reduce its power in the last year because of a failure of an antenna tower.
Yes, they originally had a north tower and a south tower, and the north tower had a failure. And so they took that offline and they're running everything for the south tower now. So that is a thing that did happen. And I haven't heard if they're going to repair that or not.
They didn't have any budget for it, so it's gonna depend on Congress.
Yeah, so probably not, which is sad. Questions from the online group? All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.